Welcome to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset, the leading data and analytics company for the cannabis industry.
Welcome back to the High Rise, where we talk all things cannabis, U.S. MSOs, Canadian LPs, data and market trends. It's a laid-back, data-backed conversation. I am joined today by Jeremy Berke of Insider.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sai. Yeah, appreciate you guys having me on.
Yeah, you got it. And Emily Paxi of Poseidon.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the High Rise.
All right. Yeah, we are on travel. Everything's kind of back to normal. It's my first time kind of traveling post-pandemics. Some of the audio may be a little strange this round, but it's my favorite day of the week. It's my favorite conversation of the week, so we couldn't not record it. There's always so much to talk about, so much going on in the space all the time. So, since we have you here, Jeremy, I think the first thing we should talk about is the latest out of Insider. I saw you guys published a Cost of Inequity report, and I think it was part of a broad series, but you did touch on the cannabis industry specifically. Is that correct?
Yeah. So this was a newsroom-wide project. It had been in the works for a couple months now. We were really looking at the cost, or it's right in the headline there, but the cost of inequity in the companies we cover, in the industries we cover, representation at the executive level, where investor dollars are flowing. Is that representative of the population at large, or does it select for, mostly white people, basically? And so we looked across a number of different industries. Like I said, I think there was about 52 or so reporters working on the project. Myself and my colleague Yeji, who cover the cannabis industry, we look particularly at the C-suite of the biggest cannabis companies. Our findings, shouldn't be a surprise to those of you that follow the industry closely. 90% of the top 14 cannabis companies by market cap. We did the analysis, I guess I should say, prior to Tilray and Aphria, prior to the merger going through. So now it's the top 13. But 90% of those executives are white. And, despite the disproportionate arrest records for Black and minority people in cannabis, a lot of these high salaries are still flowing to white people. And, again, that's not a value judgment, right? Like, I myself am a white man. There's nothing wrong with being a white man. Let me get that straight. And oftentimes they're the best people for the job, and there's a reason they have those jobs. But it is a data point. It is not representative of society at large, and especially in an industry like cannabis with the history and the criminalization of the plant. We believe that there's a lot of work to be done by these companies.
Yeah. Well, I love that it had such breadth and went beyond cannabis. Do you know if the cannabis industry in particular was worse? Were the findings worse than most other industries, or was it on par with what you were seeing with others?
Yeah, so it was on par. It has a ways to go, but for some of the other industries, I'm going a little bit off the top of my head here, so don't quote me on the statistics, but C-suites are largely white and male, right? For some industries, like the grocery industry, like big food, let's say, or big CPG companies, consumer packaged goods. Those were, they had a higher proportion of female executives and a higher proportion of minority executives, but, it's still the vast majority are white men. I think the numbers for those companies was in the 70s, 75, 80% or so. And that has all sorts of resultant costs. It really shows, who these executives mentor to fill their shoes, which types of people they want to invest in, if they're investing their personal capital, or, even whose ideas they listen to. So there's all these sort of cascading effects by having like-minded C-suite a similar demographically composed C-suite. And, we thought that cannabis was particularly acute just because, like I said before, the history of the industry and the history of the drug, right? A lot of cannabis companies pay a lot of lip service to saying, like, we're supporting X, Y, and Z initiatives. Social equity is a big piece of what we're doing. But then when you really look inward, who is benefiting from all of this? Who is benefiting from the company's revenue, and who is reaping these profits? It's mostly white men who probably are cut from a similar mold, maybe grew up middle class, went to business school, or, however they look, but it's very similar people sort of reaping these benefits as well. And it's not unique to cannabis. It's just particularly acute, especially when you look at it in light of the history of the industry.
Well, I think it's made worse by the fact that this is a new industry, and so we would hope we would start off on a stronger, more progressive foot in terms of how we're thinking about building these businesses. And it's interesting, part of the reason there's so much noise where I am right now is I'm in New York, and it is the number one topic really when we're talking about what this market's going to look like. And a lot of people are looking at what went terrible, what has gone wrong in places like Illinois, where they still have yet to get the equity program even really going at all. And, I think that there's hope that maybe with this market being the size that they're hoping it'll be in a $5 to $7 billion market size, that if they can at least establish at the ground floor of the new adult use market with more equity and inclusion, that we might be able to help to change the way this is trending. So, but I mean, it really does have far-reaching implications too into even the tech pieces of this industry, and we really think about it at our team, and it's just one of those things where it's almost harder to, like, the tech industry ran very far down the road, and there wasn't a lot of diversity and inclusion there, and then you have to try to retroactively fix that, and I'm hoping we can try to get ahead of it here, but not encouraging to see the data around it.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that, Emily. And I think, one of the things that's interesting with the cannabis industry, and this didn't necessarily appear in our story, but as the industry has grown up and matured, it's actually gotten worse. So there are less female executives now than there were 5 years ago. And so that's a trend that, without understanding the data and without knowing where we're at, it's really sort of hard to fix the problem. So first you have to identify it. And it is a problem. One of the other statistics that we highlighted in our story, this was coming from a Leafly report, actually, that only 2% of entrepreneurs in the cannabis industry are Black. And, Black people, depending on, what demographics you look at or how you count who is actually Black and who's not, it's around 13% of the US population. So it's clearly extremely unrepresentative and should be fixed. And, with all the lip service paid to that issue by progressive lawmakers who are pushing for cannabis reform, as well as companies that are supporting equity entrepreneurs and investing in equity entrepreneurs, social equity entrepreneurs, or people of color. The results on the ground have not really panned out yet. And Emily, to your point, there is a lot of room to change and a lot of room to fix that, but it's important to know that the state of play right now is not working for those specific goals, just based on that statistic alone.
No, I was just going to say, a lot of this is just following the money, and money, I think about this all the time. Money just begets more money, and the rest of us who have tried to build something either from the ground up or try to enter into it without all of those same access points, it's really the gatekeepers of money have been traditionally white men. And I agree with you. I'm not saying there's any. I work with a lot of white men, and I get along really well with them. And I'm very grateful to be in the room all the time. Rosie and I always talk about that, be in the room. And you get to be in the room at times, and it's this is great because you can feel like maybe you are helping to kind of shift the dynamic of that, and that you then become a conduit to someone else who can then become in the room. And so then you just try to think about how you can be that word inclusion is really where I keep going with this, because you got to get people in the room. So
just to kind of put a stake in that, part of the problem here is the money, as you've identified, Emily. At the startup level, one of the estimates we saw, just getting a license can cost $150,000, right? Who are the people that have $150,000 or at least are able to raise that from their immediate network? It's by and large, mostly white people. Speaking in proportionate terms, obviously there's exceptions on either side, but by and large, it's mostly white people. Without federal legalization, there are very few avenues to get a loan at a fair interest rate, or even from the Small Business Administration or any other kind of federal small business grant program. And so what you're left with is mostly white people who have the economic ability to buy these licenses. And then, for equity applicants and people of color that would like to come into the industry, they're often left contending with, I'm trying to think of a good word to put it, but maybe a sharkier aspect of the industry that wants to give them an unfair interest rate on a loan that they'll never be able to pay back. Maybe that loan converts to equity at some point, and the person wasn't able to talk to a lawyer to figure out how to structure their contract. And so all these things kind of result from, not all of these things, but a lot of these things do also result from the state federal conflict in the cannabis industry right now, and federal legalization, specifically what the Senate Majority Leader has discussed, Senate Majority Leader Schumer in the bill that he's proposing, that can go a long way to fixing at least a good chunk of these issues as well.
Yeah, definitely, with the social equity component that they've been talking about, and some states have, actively attempted, like Emily was mentioning in New York, and, Massachusetts, I believe, is doing some stuff around granting priority delivery licenses to minority applicants, as well as consumption lounge licenses for minority applicants. But I think, when they're doing these delivery licenses, a lot of it is because it's like the competitive landscape isn't as tough necessarily, as doing like a large scale brick and mortar, for them. And so, they may not, even if they get licensed, they may not, make the survey next year of the top 15, locations like you guys did on the analysis, just because they can't get to that scale. And I think, granting licenses is like a good starting point, but it's certainly like organizations that may already have licenses, like the ones you interviewed, what are they doing, internally to like be mindful of that, and to be bringing people in. We all know diversity is important, having a lot of different voices at the table is important, but it just seems to be something that's hasn't been as prioritized potentially. Although I did read in the article, a couple organizations I think mentioned, they've got a new head of diversity and inclusion, or they've got a task force. I can't remember the organizations that talked about that, but it seems like maybe they're trying, but it's just not reflected quite yet.
Yeah, no. I mean, to your point, it's to be very fair to the companies that we spoke to. I mean, I think it was 11 of 14 at the time, like voluntarily offered this information to us, and they made people available to discuss how they're working on it. So it's not like they're absolutely blind to this issue. It's just that they're trying to fix it, and these fixes do take time, right? The company referring to Canopy Growth, they said they're actively hiring for DEI, diversity inclusion. I think it was at the vice president level or something like that. But they're actively going out there and hiring that person. And, that would make a big difference, just having someone own that portfolio in the company and have their job be incentivized to increase that, right? Like if it's sort of this thing that people are paying lip service to, nothing's ever going to change. But if you actually have a point person who is an executive who is accountable for this, then maybe these organizations will start to see change on that. At least that's the hope.
Yeah, no, I hope to see, definitely some change. Is Insider planning on following up on this, or is this kind of a one-time deal, or it's to be determined what you might do with this?
Yeah, I would say to be determined. I mean, we definitely like to follow the story. We have nothing like in the works that I can like say or discuss right now, but definitely a story that we'd like to follow. We hear a lot about it from sources. This is part of the key reason why a lot of people are interested in the cannabis industry in the first place. It's this idea of economic empowerment. And so it's a really rich area for us to cover. And, especially when companies are going out there and being very public about all the good deeds they're doing, in the social equity realm, that kind of clues us in to, okay, who should we be paying attention to? Is this a press release, or does the company really own this and show this? That's sort of a good area of red meat for reporters, for sure, I would say.
Yeah, I bet it is. And there is so much around this. I'm concerned a bit with like the federal legalization and some of Schumer's plans around it, because it seems like on the Republican side, and as hard as it is to get anything through, it does seem like, this is a triggering issue for that side, it would seem. But it is so important for all these reasons we're talking about, right?
Yes.
And so it's like, how do you get something across the line, but at the same time make sure that we don't lose sight of this, in some capacity? And then that's a hard problem, and I'm sure that's maybe why it's taking so long to see something, introduced from Schumer and team, potentially.
Yeah, and for all intents and purposes, from what I understand, and I don't have much insight more than you guys would, but Schumer's team is working very hard on this issue. They have a huge team of people, working on it, trying to figure out how best to, proportion out tax revenue, how to divvy up licenses. And so they're taking this very, very seriously. And I think side, to your point, that is part of the reason why it's taking so long. And there is also a lot of Republican opposition to just like creating a larger government framework, new bureaucracies to figure out these license structures. Creating new taxes is a difficult thing for Republicans to swallow and vote for. So it'll be interesting to see what the final bill looks like and if it has a shot in the Senate.
Yeah, certainly. And at the state level too, like, hopefully with every new market, every new region that legalizes, they can learn from the other, states. And like I think back to Washington State and Colorado State, and it wasn't even part of the conversation, social equity, and all the harms that prohibition caused. It really, what I remember, and it was so long ago now, in Washington specifically, they kept it pretty basic because they were really concerned about just getting it across the line. And they did. And I don't believe that there's any sort of provision still, and nothing's kind of gone back and changed, in Washington after all that time. And so, that's an example of like it's I think a net positive. It got across the line, but kind of a negative that they don't have the social equity component as fleshed out as you might see in a market like New York, where it's like a new state. They can look at the other states that aren't doing didn't execute on that portion of it and do a better job of it, and having California go out there and attempt it. And I think I don't think it's gone that great from what I've heard. I can't think of like a lot of great success stories with it, unfortunately. But the fact that it's out there and we're talking about it and people are thinking about it, and it does exist in some form is good. But hopefully New York it can learn from that. Obviously, Massachusetts is trying to do things with delivery. And then at the federal level, hopefully they can, take those learnings and actually, see something happen. But I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. Certainly an important issue. And one of those things that as you get more involved in the space, like when I first got into the cannabis industry in 2010, it didn't cross my mind, like what prohibition, the damage it's done, the harms that it's done. But as you get closer to it, you learn a lot more about it, and you recognize like there, needs to have some component of this, but it's tough. But at least they're mindful, and these companies that you're talking to, are working on it, and hopefully some of the social equity stuff gets sorted out and people figure out a good way to execute on it, because it hasn't been easy, and I don't think it's going particularly well.
Yeah, I mean, there is one program that we should all look at, which is the Oakland program. There was mentorship, there was lending, there were a lot of things that were very good in that program, and I don't understand. In fact, we spoke about it with some of the people who were involved in it, and to your point, Si, I just don't understand why there's not information sharing and why we're reinventing the wheel or thinking we're reinventing the wheel in every market we go into. But I think that's if everybody spent some time digging in on that equity program in Oakland, it would be very enlightening, and it has worked, because there's two things. Like you can't just say you can get the license if you can't get access to the capital. And as we were just talking with Matt McGinley about this, the analysts at Needham, about how much you really have to spend to stand up a retail operation. You can do it affordably. I mean, there are rent factors, of course, depending on where the locations are, but really there are ways to do this, and lending programs could be a way to help that for sure.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I was just going to say, I mean, the last point I was going to make there, which both of you touched on, is just that we do have a history now of seeing what has worked in states like California and Colorado and Oregon. In 2012, it was basically a green field. In 2021, we have a decade to show mostly what hasn't worked, but we should be able to learn from failure, and policymakers should be able to learn from failure and figure out how to do better in the next go around. Like there's a reason why states are the laboratories of democracy. It's like a 10th grade civics class, but there's a reason why they are, and there's a reason why we can attempt and try these policies out there and figure out how to sort of scale them up at the federal level.
Right. Yeah. You'd think it would be, look at the other states, even just at an execution level. We were talking earlier about New Jersey, when they open their stores here on the East Coast, that chances are there's not going to be enough supply, chances are there's not going to be enough access, even though, they have, 18 months or however long until it goes live. a lot of time to figure it out. And I get that it's complex, but it seems like even with all the information, the historical information that you can look at these other markets, these other states that have legalized and try and avoid mistakes, it still seems like states want to make their own mistakes or they just end up making their own mistakes. But it does get like incrementally better every time. So hopefully the same thing with social equity here, and we can hope for the best. But speaking of federal government, the other big news that everyone, I think, around the world, or at least in the U.S., has heard of is the Supreme Court's Justice Clarence Thomas wrote a statement on the industry, and it was pretty compelling. I thought it kind of talked about how an ordinary person, he wrote, might not understand, the nuance between the federal position and a state position and the risks that entails. And it gave some examples like cash only businesses are high risk for robberies. And so you might have a security guard at the facility to, support that. And maybe in your state, you can have an armed security guard. But if you have, a weapon and cannabis, then, you're in serious trouble at the federal level, right? And just how operators might not recognize that. And there's just we're at this kind of inflection point, it seems like, where they're even saying like this is essentially untenable, and maybe the federal government needs to get out of this position. And it was pretty exciting to see that come through. Do you guys think it'll have any impact? Do you think it'll help push things forward? I feel like the people I talked to, like a lot of people heard about it, people that aren't even that close to the cannabis industry, which was good. So that's notable that it hit the radar. So hearts and minds. But do you think this will drive change at the federal level or push it forward faster?
Emily, you want to start or?
Yeah, I'll start. I
Yeah.
mean, when I think the government is working, the judicial branch is my favorite branch because I feel like it's meant to be dispassionate. It's meant to do the thing based on what's right and what makes sense, using the Constitution at the core of its decision making and influence instead of people who vote for you, which is why politicians are so fallible, frankly, because there's like a whole power dynamic. I mean, there's power in everything and ego and everything, but I thought this was a very important step forward because even judges do lean towards more conservative or more progressive. And he does lean more towards a conservative point of view. And I think it does indicate that he's kind of trying to take that and point to it and say, from a rational standpoint, this no longer makes sense. It never made sense, but especially now in the world that we live in today, does not make sense. And so I don't know what influence it will have on the lawmakers, because I just don't know, because I feel like right now our government's not getting out of its own way. But I think from our industry standpoint and from the, to your point, side, people who are not even that like interested maybe or involved in our industry, to see this was a very powerful flex. And I think it was something that could have a domino effect kind of throughout this whole process. So I'm pretty happy about it, and I feel glad that he took that step to speak up about it. And especially because the Supreme Court has been turning down hearing cases about cannabis issues, including 280E. And so I feel like that again was another step forward on his part. Like, if we're not going to make the effort to hear these cases, then at least I'm going to stand up and speak about this and do it from the seat of being a justice. And so to me, that really resonated and was important.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Emily was saying. I do have a bit more of a, I guess cynical is the wrong word, but like he did write this. It wasn't an opinion, right? Like, they did decline to hear the 280E case in the first place. He decided to write a statement about the case, and so that there is a technical difference there. It wasn't like this was the majority of the Supreme Court deciding that cannabis prohibition is irrational and needs to be overturned, right? It was one pretty hard right judge saying that the federal government was overreaching in a specific instance. So, it's consistent with a hard right judge like Clarence Thomas. I mean, they like to push back against the federal government encroaching on states and encroaching on industry. And as well, I don't think that Clarence Thomas has any sort of affinity for marijuana legalization. I don't think he cares either way. I just think that, to Emily's point, he was pointing out that it is incoherent, and that given the fact that states are legalizing now, given the fact that voters are choosing to do so, the more coherent position is coming up with some clarity at the federal level, whether that's full-scale legalization or descheduling or something, like the States Act, which we saw in the previous Congress, the previous legislative session, that will allow states to chart their own path free of federal interference. That was basically President Obama's standpoint on things, like under, what we all call the Cole memo, right? Where he basically said the DOJ shouldn't use any money, financial resources to go after states with legal cannabis, or I think it was particularly medical cannabis at that time. But, what Clarence Thomas is doing is basically saying, like, if we're going to have something like the Cole memo, we need to change federal rule. Otherwise, we're sort of undermining the rule of law in general. I don't think it was him saying, like, I want to be an activist judge and legalize marijuana, obviously. And since Clarence Thomas's views on a lot of subjects, would probably preclude him from being supportive of marijuana legalization, I guess. But, I don't know what's going on inside his head better than anyone else does.
I love to imagine Clarence Thomas as a major advocate for marijuana change, and just all of a sudden Clarence really into weed. That would be incredible. But yeah, certainly not the case, unfortunately. But yeah, it's good to see. It's these little, these brick by brick type of situations that, I don't know, it's getting there. It's all getting there. Just sometimes wish it would get there a little faster, but still all good news.
Just in one other thing is that within 24 hours, the Mexican Supreme Court, who had been pushing for legalization and access to cannabis on a federal level, after so many quarters of the Senate kicking the can down the road and the lawmakers not getting it done, the Supreme Court basically said yesterday, like, we're done with this. And so now you're hearing, I will say, because we do talk a lot with different groups down there, and there's multiple parties down there, and the lawmakers definitely read that as, like, we've got to kick into high gear and get this going in September when we're back in session. And we heard it from Montreal, we heard, and so even the president stood up and was like, we got to get this done. And I think it's just another example of the judicial system stepping in and saying, hey, it's not to be ignored the way that we feel about this, and that we're using Constitution and trying to keep that as the keystone to how we're driving our opinions on these matters. So
that is a really good analogy. For the longest time in Mexico, the Supreme Court has been delaying and giving them time, right, to figure out legislation, and it seems like it just hasn't happened, and so they just forced it and said, okay, well, then it's going to be decrimmed and good to go. But the problem with that is, if they don't get legislation, then you don't have any sort of legal framework for licensing and how the whole structure is going to work. Do you think that could happen here one day? Do you think our court, like, could some case come and push our courts to say, you know what, we've got to change policy and we're going to do it?
It's a good question. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think it's an astute point. I mean, I think if Congress can't get it done, we're likely to see this federal state conflict play out in all these other arenas, and at some point there will be a case, that makes it up to the federal level. And if the Supreme Court wants to hear it, I think when you have a very conservative justice like Clarence Thomas calling this into question, the chances are probably good, depending on what the case is, that prohibition may be overturned. That being said, if I was a betting man, I'm not. I would think that Congress would act before the courts on this, just given all the energy around it, and given the fact that the Democrats, if they don't get it done, would probably use it as a wedge issue during the midterms in 2022. So the momentum is there, and the time is now for them to do it. But Sai, to your point, and to Emily, to your broader point, which is really smart, that the courts are a way to sort of mitigate these conflicts. I do think if it ends up in the Supreme Court, it will be overturned. It's just a matter of it getting there or Congress getting to it first.
Yeah. Now, that's an interesting analogy and interesting timing for sure. That's a good call out. Well, moving away from legislation and onto the U.S. MSOs, some news this week there out of California. The Glass House organization completed their de-SPAC, and I was reading a bit about it, and I thought some interesting takeaways from kind of how they're positioning the organization, particularly around retail. They have a sizable footprint for grow, definitely, but the retail has historically been a bit smaller as far as door count. I think it's 4 cannabis retailers and dispensaries in California right now, but they are going to be expanding it with some sort of licensing agreement or merger agreement with Element 7, which apparently has 17 licensed stores, which would get them to 23 open locations by the end of 2022, which is what they're saying. So somehow maybe they're getting a couple more licenses in addition to the Element 7, because the math doesn't kind of add up there. They have 17 through Element 7, and I think a couple more coming in from just Glass House. But anyways, 23 open locations in California, which is, according to them, the largest single store count of any single California cannabis operator. And it's kind of like the MSO model, like what we see in these limited license markets, where they're coming in and they're grabbing 5, 10, 15 licenses, depending on the market, and growing into that. And it's actually quite surprising to me that California doesn't have anything like that. Like there's no location that has that many stores. But it is interesting to see that they're making that play. And I think that's always been their position, that the California SSO is going to be maybe moving towards the MSO territory over time, grow in California, build these brands in California, and then go after these limited license markets, the emerging Midwest, East Coast markets. And the MSOs are kind of doing the opposite, starting there and working their way towards California, moving west, maybe partnering with brands out of California, maybe acquiring brands in California, certainly acquiring retail locations as well. So yeah, this is a big number, 23 stores. What do you guys think about that? Why do you think that there hasn't been a chain of 23 stores in California, given it's the largest adult use market out there? Is it a licensing issue? Is it just the way the market's built out? What could it be?
It's myriad issues in California. It's for the California market, it's super hard. And so everywhere you go, you've got different levers you've got to pull to be able to get the access to try to get these stores not only approved, but opened. We still have jurisdictions that are just now starting to license retail opportunities in California. So, and those jurisdictions, like there's so much infighting. Like for example, I think it's called Fairfield. There was an application process. I was even involved. I got, interviewed as I'm on the board of a company. We went through this whole process, and then they assigned 3 licenses of the whatever, and they had more that they were going to assign, and then everybody's suing everybody because apparently there was someone getting paid and unfair practices. And so these things have, but that's just one jurisdiction scenario of how that has happened in California. And so it's just harder than anyone would like it to be. Even like in Sonoma County, Sonoma Square, Napa's taken forever to get adult use going. And we, after the pandemic, we started to see more jurisdictions in California start opening up and saying they'll be amenable to having retail licenses there. But it's been incredibly hard, and each one is very different. And even the people who are really, really good at winning these licenses still struggle. Even like GTI in Pasadena, they've had to work really hard to get that door and to get that door open. So it's interesting. And then within this, within the state, you have the mass markets where you have like California, you have San Francisco and Los Angeles, and you have a lot of doors there, not enough. And depending on the market, you can be competing heavily. Like Los Angeles, you're competing heavily with the illicit market stores. Like if you can believe this, there are still stores that are open in Los Angeles that are not licensed they're so brazen. They're open till like 1 a.m, which, like they do crazy things. And then you have the illegal operators that are doing delivery. So it's really complicated. And so that's why I don't think it's not for wanting or lack of trying, for sure, because I've seen a lot of groups try to achieve this and they've been burned. Element 7 has a ways to go. When you dig in on the different doors, you have to really understand, the quality of them and how the path to getting them opened. And then what's more is you have to look at the revenue potential of each door, because any of these doors that are under 3 million, you're going to struggle to really have any sense of profitability or EBITDA margin across the organization. You have to be really, really careful about that, because it'll just drag down your numbers, which the public markets are used to the East Coast numbers, which have a lot more EBITDA juice to them. And so it's just something to keep in mind in terms of what the investor community is expecting from these operations.
Yeah, that's interesting. They did report some revenue numbers as well. They talked about their 4 dispensaries generated 365,000 transactions with an average in-store ticket of $65 and a delivery ticket of $101 in 2020. So if we just take the like $65 across all of that, it's pretty good sized stores. It looks like comes out to about a $6 million per store. That's for the Glass House locations that they have currently, not for the Element 7. They don't report any of Element 7's numbers, but
Yeah,
not too bad.
that's good. Yeah, for sure. But I'm just saying, it's just there's a lot to do to get to 23 doors open and making sure they're all
From
running
4 to 23
optimally.
is, yeah, that's a huge jump, 4 to 23. Yeah, so a lot of risk, I'm sure, there. And are they all going to perform just as well? Like, who knows? But yeah, it is interesting that, you mentioned like GTI struggling, with the Pasadena location and how hard it is. So if they manage to pull this off and open these 23 doors and, get to these kinds of revenues, do you think they're pretty well positioned in the California market at that point?
I think absolutely, and I think I spoke to Graham Fair on Monday as the transaction went through, and one of the points he was making, which I guess I mean I'm not in California, right, and it hadn't quite crystallized in my mind, was just how large of a state it is, and I don't have to tell you guys this because you live there, but California itself is the size of Canada, right, and so despite the fact that Glass House Group is the single state operator model, it will be as large or larger than a lot of MSOs at that point. And just owning the California market is a huge piece of that. And it has, again, a lot of the technical difficulties that MSOs face, right? Because California is all these overlapping jurisdictions. They all have different rules from the municipal level to the state level. And so each store might have a different framework they have to comply with. And, Emily, to your point, competing against the black market or the illicit market, it seems, I guess, from the numbers I've seen, remarkably resilient in California, even compared to other states. And so eating into that and then owning those 23 stores, I think, would be a huge windfall if they can, like you said, Sai, get everything set up and actually open the doors. Because I think there's a lot that needs to happen from now until then, till they actually have customers going through and that showing up on their balance sheet.
Right. But it is pretty interesting narrative, interesting scale. And for so long, I feel like, the companies of this size have been in the limited license markets. And now it's pretty interesting to be able to kind of cover some of this happening in California, which, yeah, is exactly right. Is a higher population count than Canada, is driving more sales than Canada, which is an entire country. So it'll be really interesting to see, if they can execute on that plan of starting California, build the brand, and then take that brand and bring it nationwide. I know the parent company has talked about positioning themselves in a similar way. And I know that the two organizations also have some relationships on supply, even though somewhat, competitive too. It'll just be interesting to see if they can execute on that before the GTIs of the world can come into California and try and, get this kind of store count, get this kind of coverage and support a market of this scale. Speaking of California, some other news, I guess all California in the US here this week, but Planet 13 is opening or opened in Orange County, just a few minutes from Disneyland. LA Magazine had a pretty good article on it where they talk about how it's positioned to be the FAO Schwartz of weed. And for those that may or may not be familiar with FAO Schwartz, but it was kind of a destination toy store in New York and I think some other areas, really over the top, kind of an experience, right? When you go in, instead of just going to buy a toy, you have this experience. But it's a funny analogy that they make because FAO Schwartz isn't around anymore. It's like Toys R Us. The toy stores haven't done particularly well. But this idea of this destination, this reason to go there, and I think part of it could be positioned like that because of the Disneyland aspect. To capture all this tourist traffic. I think that's what they've done so well in Las Vegas. They mention in the article that they see 100,000 people per month coming into the Planet 13 store in Las Vegas, and they call out Thursday to Sunday. They have a 1.5 hour wait to purchase cannabis, which actually sounds really painful and quite miserable. Like, I think you can buy a car faster than you can buy cannabis and buying a car seems like it takes forever if you've ever had to deal with a dealer sitting in there. So an hour and a half wait, but that just shows the scale, right? That they're attracting this massive audience of most likely tourists in Las Vegas coming through. But 100,000 people. When we were just talking about Glass House, the numbers that they're reporting, 365,000 transactions. If 100,000 people, when they say seeing 100,000 people, I'm assuming those are 100,000 transactions a month. That's four times the size. I mean, it's well over 1 million transactions and could be high basket size because of the tourist aspect, right? So people might be even spending more while they're there. So it'll be interesting to see if they can capture the magic, what they've done in Las Vegas. But it seems like the right idea. Go to somewhere where there's, a reason for tourists to come. I haven't had a chance to check it out yet, but will be interesting to see. Do you think that this model is this all that they have, or do they have to now go find another kind of touristy area to capture? I mean, they're kind of setting a precedent with this scale. 55,000 square feet of store. I mean, that's big, right? It has stores within stores where certain brands will have their own stores, so you can, shop at the Stizzy store or the select store within the store. So, I mean, is that the model? If it is, they can only have a handful of stores, these big flagships. But it is interesting to see. Any thoughts or opinions on the strategy?
Yeah, I mean, if I'll take off my reporter hat for a second here, and since we're among friends, like put on my consumer hat. I would say it's cool, it's interesting. I know Planet 13's Vegas store makes a lot of money, and I think it's a fun experience to go there. Like for the yearly cannabis congress, like everyone's shopping at Planet 13, and you bump into people. It's a fun experience. At the same time, I'm 28 years old. I buy increasingly less and less of everything in stores, right? I rely on Uber Eats a lot for restaurant food. I shop on Amazon. So no, I don't think it is. I don't think it is the model of the future. I think it can. There is particular use cases like Hollywood and Vegas where we have a lot of tourists. It's fun, but I do think that eventually cannabis consumers will move to mostly delivery options as regulators, iron that out. I mean, why would you, like you said, Sai, wait in line for an hour and a half to buy your cannabis? Let's say you are hungover on a Sunday or something, when you could sit on your couch and it could come to you within an hour, right? So that's sort of my take on it. As a consumer and as sort of a target market for a lot of these companies, I will go to those stores and I think they're cool. I think it's a fun experience, but the majority of my purchases will not be made through those stores. I believe that I will be buying from delivery services as much as possible. And I think that, again, to my earlier point, like as regulations ease, I think there are people will be buying cannabis in a lot of places that aren't dispensaries, like whether that's beverages that may be in grocery stores or I don't know, infused food in restaurants. I'm just sort of going off the top of my head here, but I think there will be a lot of other places that people are buying cannabis as well, not just in these superstores.
Yeah, totally agree. And there's a another kind of anchor store for the Cookies brand that's opening pretty close there in Orange County as well. And I think it's a bit smaller than the Planet 13 store, something like 10, 11,000 square feet. But what I thought was interesting is that they're connecting their clothing store, the lifestyle brand that they have, to the dispensary, so you can go and purchase clothes and at the same time purchase their cannabis. And that's an interesting way to connect the dots. I've seen the Cookies brand sold at traditional retail, not the cannabis Cookies brand, but clothing, streetwear type clothing is available in a lot of places. And so it's a great way to build the brand, and now they can actually connect the dots between the brand at the same location. So that was pretty interesting. And it also happens to be in Orange County and Santa Ana there. So I wonder if they're going to try and capture some of that same traffic that Planet 13 is doing, although at a bit of a smaller scale. But just interesting that they're both opening at the same time here.
Yeah, and I mean, one sort of outside of cannabis, one sort of corollary here is direct to consumer brands opening brick and mortar retail shops, right? It's not like they think the store. I mean, at least in Planet 13, I'm sure hopes that they'll have a good margin on the products to sell in their stores, but at the end of the day, the brick and mortar doesn't have to be a money making operation. It can be an advertisement for your products. Like I'm thinking of, Casper, like the DTC mattress company. It's pretty hot among millennials. They recently opened a store right by my apartment downtown Brooklyn in DeKalb Market, which is sort of like one of the biggest malls in Brooklyn. High traffic area, a lot of people. There are a lot of people in the Casper store every time I walk by there. I think probably less than 5% of them actually leave with a mattress. They're just going to try it out. It's good brand awareness. It's cool. It's in Brooklyn. So that's kind of what I think the overall larger play may end up being. But I'm sure right now, as they're opening stores, they're hoping to make money, and they definitely will in the short term make a lot of money. Like you said, it's Orange County, it's Las Vegas. There's a lot of tourists coming in, maybe from states without legal weed, so they're willing to pay a lot of money and wait in line for the experience.
Yeah, no, that's a great analogy. And it is a good way for these direct to consumer brands to have a footprint, in the real world. And so, yeah, with cookies, having this footprint, with their lifestyle brand, but also with the cannabis brand, I think it's pretty clever. And we'll see, how well it does. And, I know they did this Las Vegas launch recently in partnership with GTI, and that seemed to be pretty successful. So, yeah, I'm sure we'll see something similar coming out of California. And then I guess to close out today, touch on a bit of Canada news, Canadian LPs. So the big headline this week was Sweetwater, which is, Tilray, originally a Aphria acquisition. Sweetwater Beverages, a beer company based out of Atlanta, I believe. And, this was Afria's way of, making an investment in the US with a play to eventually kind of get, some toehold here post legalization. And it seemed like the beer company was what they wanted to do. Is one strategy we've talked about in the past here. We've talked about, the CBD strategy that some brands have tried. But the news this week was that they did a collaboration with their Broken Coast brand. So they're introducing a new ale, a Broken Coast ale at Sweetwater. And I believe it'll be sold in the US, which is where Sweetwater is. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I mean, it makes sense on paper, right? They own this brewer, and they own this Canadian, LP, this Canadian cannabis brand. Well, we got to connect the dots here. But I think the Broken Coast brand for an American audience, in today's world, probably doesn't resonate, right? Unless they're traveling to Canada and maybe they've seen it at a store. Is this just trying to connect the dots, trying to build some narrative, or Jeremy, do you think that they have an opportunity to build some awareness for a future brand if it comes into the US? Like, why invest and do this kind of collaboration?
Yeah, it's a good point, and I don't know if I fully see the value in it, but if I had to put myself in their shoes, I think it is again a branding opportunity. It's a way to advertise their products to American consumers before they're able to actually deliver those products to American consumers. And so, I do think that they hope that if they sort of penetrate these markets, if people are like, oh yeah, Broken Coast, Sweetwater, Sweetwater is known for its like 420 beer, and it's got that sort of cannabis connotation, then I think, maybe that little bit of awareness that people have will sort of help LPs like Tilray come in and compete in the US when they're able to. Because I think they're worried basically that legislation's not moving fast enough. A lot of the MSOs and startups already have a big toehold in the US market. So they're worried that all that market share is basically going to be off the table by the time they're able to come in. And so they're doing whatever they can to ensure that they have at least some piece of the pie left over for them. Would I make those same decisions if I was an executive? Probably not, but I do see the rationalization. And I do think that there is, there is something to be said for brand awareness, right? I mean, it is everything.
Sure.
It's everything people are competing for in cannabis right now, as Sai, you obviously are super well aware of. And so, it's useful. Do I think that it's really going to connect the dots to answer your specific question? I'm not so sure about that.
Yeah, it certainly feels like the long game here, right? Because if the beer is introduced, people start seeing the brand, and then by the time we have federal legalization, they can bring the brand in, unless they're planning to bring it in a different way. But they're just limited, right? Because of where they're traded, and they can't have a
Yeah.
foothold with THC-based products in the U.S. So it does seem like the long play, because even with federal legalization, they're going to have months and months before they can jump in and truly execute. But I get it. I mean, if they own the Sweetwater Brewing Company and they need to start connecting the dots, like, it makes sense. But I was surprised to see, I've seen like hemp-based beers in the past that, I don't think are around these days, but it really has no connection. I think that the head grower for Broken Coast kind of
No.
collabed with the head brewer, and just, yeah, I was like, I like this flavor profile, and that's about as close to cannabis as it gets. Otherwise, it's just the Broken Coast name. But yeah, interesting, interesting strategy for sure. I'm I'll try it. I'll try the beer if I ever, get a chance to, just to see.
Right.
But we'll see. Yeah, we'll see if consumers actually
Yeah.
go out and look for it.
They bought a beer company, so they have to do something with it. That's the end of the day. So
Exactly. That's probably, probably the answer here, right? And I'm overthinking it. Like, what's the strategy here? It's like, well, strategy is we own this beer company and we're a cannabis company, so you got to do something.
right.
That's
That's right.
that's the executive presentation that I'm sure happened. Well, Jeremy, thanks so much for joining us. Where can everyone find you?
You can find me on Twitter at JFBerke if you want to follow along with our reporting and my mostly unfortunate tweets. As well, I publish a free weekly newsletter that I'd encourage you all to sign up for. It's Insider Cannabis. You can find the sign up link on my author page or on my Twitter profile. I believe I got to make sure it's there. But it's a free weekly newsletter. We sort of round up all the developments, whether it's policy, deals, personalities, people moves, everything you need to know that happened in the cannabis world that week. So I'd encourage you all to sign up for that. If you like what you read, don't like what you read, I'd encourage you all to get in touch and tell me what I can do better as well. So I'd appreciate that.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. All that stuff is great and a great resource for me. So yeah, everyone should definitely check it out. Well, that'll do it for the High Rise this week. We'll see everyone next week with, I'm sure, more crazy cannabis news and hopefully more progress as this whole industry keeps moving forward.
Thanks for listening to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset. For more information on Headset, visit headset.io.